Dawn at the dock. The pilings are black with rot. Wet hemp ropes drag through the slime. Bananas sweat in split crates, their skins bruised and leaking sweet latex. Flies gather where the fruit has burst open. Steamer horn groans somewhere in the fog while boots grind rail grease into the planks. Everything smells too sweet and slightly dead. Men move fast because the cargo bruises easily. Clerks move faster because numbers spoil even faster than fruit. A delay here means a loss in Boston. A signature there means a concession in Honduras. A rail line inland means another valley no longer belongs to itself. This was not a fruit company moving produce. It was an American land empire learning how to rule without a flag. So what was United Fruit, really? A business that happened to be powerful, or a private state that happened to sell bananas? Chapter 1. The Cargo That Lied. Consider what a banana actually is, in the context of power. It is not wheat. It does not feed armies. It is not cotton. It does not clothe an industrial workforce. It is not rubber or copper or oil. No general has ever said that the control of bananas was a matter of national survival. And yet the company built around the banana became one of the most politically consequential American enterprises of the 20th century, not in spite of the fruit's ordinariness, but partly because of it. Ordinariness is excellent cover. When United Fruit Company was operating at its peak in the early 1950s, it was not merely the largest employer in Central America. It held more land than it could ever farm. It ran the railroads. It controlled the only deep-water ports in several countries. It managed postal systems. It owned a private telegraph and radio network that in some regions was faster and more reliable than any government's. It held contracts written so deeply into the constitutions of host nations that canceling them would have required rewriting the law itself. None of that appears on the label of a banana. The word banana republic entered the American language in the early 1900s, coined by the writer O. Henry from a Honduras-based story. The phrase stuck because it felt like a joke. A small maritime banana republic, something to laugh at, a place so minor, so sleepy, so defined by a single fruit that the very idea of its politics seemed comic. That laughter served a function. It made the subject feel unserious. It made the people living inside those countries feel like props in someone else's comedy. And it made the machinery running underneath the joke invisible. When a food item becomes shorthand for political corruption, it is worth asking whether the fruit created the condition or merely provided the packaging that hid the machinery underneath. The banana did not hollow out these governments. Something was already there, opening the door. Chapter 2. The Men Who Learned to Sell a Tropic. The company did not begin as an empire. It began as an accident of perishability. In the 1870s, the banana was still a novelty in the United States. It had appeared at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in 1876, wrapped in foil and sold for 10 cents, which was expensive enough that many Americans remembered tasting their first one as an event. The fruit was exotic, briefly fashionable, and deeply inconvenient. It had to travel fast, which meant it needed ships fast enough to beat the bruising and docks close enough to the cities to beat the rot. A man named Minor Keith understood this problem better than almost anyone alive. Keith was not a visionary in the romantic sense. He was a contractor. In 1872, his family was already building railways in Costa Rica for the Costa Rican government, a deal struck with the promise that rail access would modernize the country's interior and connect its coffee highlands to the Atlantic coast. The government ran short of money. Keith took land in exchange. He took a lot of land. And on land that needed something to grow, he planted bananas. The bananas fed the rail workers. Then they fed the ships that came to collect coffee. Then they became a product in themselves, moving north to New Orleans and Boston and New York, arriving just in time because the rail line he had built was exactly the right length for the journey the fruit needed to survive. By 1899, Keith's Central American interests merged with the Boston Fruit Company, a firm built by Andrew Preston, a Massachusetts produce merchant who had spent years refining the Caribbean banana trade into something approaching a system. Preston became United Fruit's first president. Keith became its largest individual shareholder. What they built together was, on the surface, a food distribution company. But notice what it actually controlled. Land granted by governments in exchange for infrastructure, railways connecting interior agriculture to coastal ports, shipping lines timed to the biology of a perishable crop, and concessions that gave the company preferential treatment no local competitor could match. Perishability, it turned out, was not a weakness. It was a justification. The banana spoiled in days, which meant everything between the plantation and the grocery shelf had to be owned or at least controlled by the same organization. Any gap in the chain meant loss, and loss, the company's founders discovered, was the most persuasive argument for expansion ever invented. Was this simply efficient capitalism, rational vertical integration in pursuit of reliable margins? Or was it the first move in something else, a logic of territorial control that the banana only made necessary in the first place? Chapter 3. When the phrase became a warning. There is a version of this story that feels like folklore. Small countries, big fruit, corrupt generals, American businessmen arriving with briefcases and leaving with concessions. The story has been told so many times that it has acquired the smooth texture of myth, something from another era, safely distant, slightly absurd. Strip that away. O. Henry's phrase, "this small maritime banana republic," was not meant as a compliment when he wrote it, and it was not received as one by the people who lived inside those republics. What the phrase actually described was a specific political-economic arrangement, a country whose economy depended so completely on a single export crop grown and shipped by a single foreign company that the government's fiscal health, its credit, its infrastructure, and eventually its survival were tied to the goodwill of that company rather than to the welfare of its own citizens. That is not a joke. That is a structural condition. The Tella Railroad Company was a subsidiary of United Fruit. It operated in Honduras, and it did not merely run trains. According to historical records, it overtly controlled Honduras's government for stretches of the early 20th century, not through military occupation, not through formal annexation, but through the more durable mechanism of dependency. When a government cannot build its own roads, when it cannot mail its own letters without the company's infrastructure, when the only port capable of handling international shipping belongs to a private firm, the relationship between the state and that firm is no longer a vendor relationship. It is something closer to a governing arrangement with different letterhead. By the early 1900s, United Fruit was present in one form or another across Guatemala, Honduras, Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia, Cuba, Jamaica, and the Dominican Republic. Not all of those presences were equal, but they shared a template: concessions exchanged for infrastructure, land accumulated far beyond what could be cultivated, and terms written to make revision almost legally impossible. Here is what that looked like in one snapshot of numbers, the kind of figures that only become shocking when you say them all together. In Guatemala alone, United Fruit held 550,000 acres of land, of which no more than 15% was under active cultivation. 2% of Guatemala's population controlled more than 72% of its arable land. The company's banana holdings in Colombia covered 220,000 acres. 25,000 workers labored across those Colombian plantations. In the Guatemalan constitution of the era, contracts with the company were written with provisions so favorable that adjusting them required not just legislation, but political courage no local government yet possessed. These were not edge cases. This was the system operating as designed. The question worth sitting with is not whether countries like Honduras or Guatemala were vulnerable. Of course they were. The question is whether fruit company power actively helped produce that vulnerability, whether the companies arrived to exploit a weakness or arrived and then made the weakness permanent. The record suggests the answer is more uncomfortable than either version alone. Chapter 4. Land Before Fruit. To understand what United Fruit actually was, you have to understand why a banana company wanted land it was never going to farm. This is the part that requires the most careful attention, because it runs against common sense. Businesses are supposed to use what they own. Farmland that sits idle is farmland generating no revenue. By the logic of the balance sheet, unused acreage is dead weight. And yet, United Fruit accumulated unused acreage with the same intensity it applied to everything else. It was not an oversight. It was a strategy. The banana is a fragile crop. It is vulnerable to weather, to flooding, to disease. In the early decades of the industry, Panama disease, a soil fungus, could move through a plantation and render the land unworkable in a matter of years. When your primary product can be destroyed by the ground it grows in, the sensible response is to hold more ground than you need. When one plot fails, you move. The excess is insurance. But the excess was also something else. Land in Central America in the early 20th century was not merely property. It was access. It was labor. It was altitude and drainage, and the proximity of rivers used for irrigation and transport. Land meant you could set the terms of employment because workers had no alternative employer within reasonable distance. Land meant you could decide what got built and what stayed dirt road and what stayed jungle. Land meant you control the radius within which anyone near you had to live. In Guatemala, this logic reached its most explicit expression. By the early 1950s, United Fruit was the largest single landowner in the country. Its holdings there totaled approximately 550,000 acres. The company's own internal accounting made clear that fewer than 15% of those acres were under active cultivation at any given time. The rest sat in reserve, legally owned, physically controlled, economically silent. When Guatemala's government eventually moved to reform its land laws, the law it passed had a specific threshold. Any privately held land above 223 acres that was not under active cultivation was subject to redistribution. The compensation offered was fair by the standard of the declared tax value. The company had declared its idle land at very low values because low valuations meant lower taxes. When the government offered compensation based on those same declared values, United Fruit protested that the land was worth far more than it had ever told the tax authorities. That detail is worth staying with. A company that had spent decades systematically undervaluing its own land for tax purposes suddenly argued the moment that land faced redistribution that the tax valuations were an injustice. The land had always been worth more. It had simply never been convenient to say so until it was being taken away. Under Guatemala's Decree 900, enacted in June of 1952, approximately 234,000 acres of United Fruit land near Tiquisate were ordered expropriated in early 1953. In February of 1954, another 172,532 acres near Bananera followed. The total expropriated came to roughly 400,000 acres out of the original 550,000. United Fruit did not protest only through lawyers and diplomats. It understood with exceptional clarity that idle acreage was not idle at all. It was the stored form of every other kind of power the company possessed. Was unused land inefficiency? A failed allocation of capital in countries that desperately needed agricultural development? Or was it the deliberate reservation of leverage, a pressure system maintained at rest, ready to be activated whenever the terms of coexistence needed to be renegotiated? The acreage sitting dormant in the Guatemalan highlands answers that question, if you ask it correctly. Chapter 5. Rails, Ports, Mail. A banana without infrastructure is just a piece of fruit rotting in a field. The men who built United Fruit understood this before they understood almost anything else about the business. The crop was the justification. The system built to move the crop was the point. And the system, the rails, the ports, the telegraphs, the radio towers, the refrigerated ships, that system turned out to be worth far more than any harvest it ever carried. In Guatemala, the arrangement began modestly enough. The dictator Manuel Estrada Cabrera, who ran the country with the blunt efficiency of a man who understood that infrastructure was power before the American company did, hired United Fruit in 1901 to manage Guatemala's national postal service. Think about that slowly. A foreign fruit company running a country's mail, letters from citizens to their families, government dispatches, commercial correspondence, all of it flowing through an American corporation's hands before it reached its destination. 3 years later, in 1904, Estrada Cabrera granted United Fruit a concession to build the railway connecting Puerto Barrios on the Atlantic coast to Guatemala City, the capital. A single rail line, but not a simple one. Puerto Barrios was the country's primary deep-water port. Guatemala City was the seat of its government and most of its commerce. The rail line between them was, in practical terms, the country's spine. And now, a private American company owned it. By 1909, the company's reach was visible enough that its maps were worth publishing. A United Fruit map from that year showed in careful detail the company's shipping routes, its railroad holdings, and its wireless telegraph network, a private communications system spanning the Caribbean basin, faster in some corridors than anything a government operated. Consider what you can do when you control the port, the railway, the telegraph, and the mail. You know what is moving before anyone else does. You know when a competitor's shipment is delayed. You know when a government official sends a letter to a foreign embassy. You know when a strike is being organized before the workers have told their families. You set the price of transport, which means you set the effective price of anything that needs to move. You can slow a rival's cargo without breaking a single law, simply by scheduling your trains first. You can accelerate a friendly government's communications and let an unfriendly one's correspondence sit. This is not speculation about intent. It is a description of what structural control makes possible. Whether United Fruit exercised every one of these advantages at every moment is a question the archives answer partially and ambiguously. That the advantages existed and were legally theirs is not ambiguous at all. If a private company runs the mail, the rails, and the port, there is a word for what that company is. The word is not vendor, it is not contractor. It sits much closer to something that has never appeared on the company's letterhead. Where exactly does commerce end and governance begin? The rail line between Puerto Barrios and Guatemala City did not answer that question. It erased it. Chapter 6. Sam the Banana Man. There is a type of man who appears at the edges of empire and understands, before the formal institutions arrive, exactly how loose everything still is. Samuel Zemurray was that man. He arrived in the United States from what is now Moldova as a teenager with almost nothing, and he learned the banana trade from the bottom, buying overripe fruit that the major importers had written off, selling it fast to small shops within range of the port before it turned. He was not elegant. He was not well connected. What he had was a precise understanding of how much could be accomplished by a man willing to move faster and think smaller than anyone watching. By the early 1900s, Zemurray had built his own fruit operation, the Cuyamel Fruit Company, working the banana zones along the Honduran coast. Cuyamel competed with United Fruit, which made United Fruit's leadership furious and made Zemurray's life complicated in the way that competing with a much larger, politically embedded corporation tends to make life complicated. In 1911, Zemurray faced a specific problem. The Honduran government, under pressure from American banking interests, was preparing to restructure the country's foreign debt in ways that would have imposed new taxes and tariffs on banana operations. Zemurray stood to lose significant money. He needed a friendlier government, so he went and got one. The exiled former Honduran President Manuel Bonilla was living in New Orleans. Zemurray found him, equipped him, and helped arrange his return to Honduras on a boat carrying weapons and a small group of mercenaries, among them a well-known soldier of fortune named Lee Christmas. Bonilla landed, moved through the country, and by 1912 was back in power. The unfavorable debt restructuring went away. Zemurray received land concessions and low taxes in its place. There was no subtlety about the transaction. A businessman had reached across the border of a sovereign nation, restored a president he preferred, and been repaid in the currency of favorable policy. The Honduran state had been a market for political outcomes, and Zemurray had simply been the buyer who showed up with the right price. In 1929, United Fruit bought Cuyamel. It bought Zemurray with it. By 1933, he was managing director of the company he had once competed against. By 1938, he was its president. He did not bring subtlety to the larger company. He brought the same instinct that had served him in New Orleans, that governments, particularly small and indebted ones, were available to the man who understood their price, and that understanding that price was a skill like any other, learnable, applicable, and not especially constrained by the legal formalities that governed other kinds of commerce. The question the Zemurray story raises is not really about one man's ethics. It is about what his story reveals about the system around him. He did not corrupt Honduran politics. He found them already in a condition where the kind of corruption he offered was purchasable. He was not an anomaly. He was evidence. Did Zemurray make these governments corrupt, or did he simply expose how available they already were to outside buyers? The distinction matters more than it might appear, because one version produces a villain, the other produces a system. Chapter 7. Company Time. Put the maps away for a moment, put the acreage figures and the railway concessions and the diplomatic cables in a drawer. Come down from the level of policy and land and sit somewhere much smaller, a bunkhouse at the edge of a banana plantation at 6 in the morning, in heat that has already been building for 2 hours, in a country where the nearest town that is not owned by the company is several hours' walk down a dirt road that the company also controls. This is where the empire lived for the people who lived inside it. United Fruit's plantation zones were not simply workplaces. They were administered territories. The company built the housing, long, low bunkhouses, sorted by the labor hierarchy, better for supervisors, minimal for cutters and loaders. It built the stores, the commissariatos, where workers bought food and goods. It ran those stores on a credit system. Workers received not always cash, but chits, tokens, slips of paper redeemable only at the company store, at prices the company set. A man could finish a week of physical labor in equatorial heat and find himself, at the end of it, having spent more at the company store than he had earned in the company's fields. The debt rolled forward. The work continued. The company built the hospitals, too. Medical care was available, which was genuinely more than many rural workers in the region had access to outside the plantation zones. But access to the hospital and access to the doctor were conditioned on employment. Leave the job, lose the care. The bodies of the workers were in this sense also a kind of held asset. Workers who were injured on the job by machinery, by the sharp weight of banana stalks, by the accidents that accumulate wherever men work fast with heavy loads in wet heat, found that compensation was inconsistent and arbitration almost impossible. The company had the lawyers. The workers had their injuries. In Colombia, where United Fruit had established its banana operations along the coast near Santa Marta, the workers eventually compiled a list of what they wanted. It is worth reciting that list because it is precise and because it sounds, to a contemporary ear, almost modest. They wanted a wage increase. They wanted a 6-day work week. They wanted hygienic dormitories. They wanted contracts signed directly with the company rather than mediated through subcontractors who skimmed the wages. They wanted accident compensation. They wanted improved hospital services. And they wanted the end of the company store payment system, payment in cash, not credit. These were not revolutionary demands. They were the demands of people who had looked at the terms of their employment and decided that the terms were not acceptable. United Fruit's response to these demands is what the next chapter is about. Were these plantations modern workplaces for their era, offering employment, housing, and medical access that many rural workers in the region lacked? Or were they enclosed economies, built precisely to keep workers structurally too weak, too indebted, and too isolated to bargain on equal terms? The company store is still there, in the architecture of the argument, if you look at it from the right angle. Chapter 8. The Square at Cienaga. December of 1928. The town of Cienaga, on the Caribbean coast of Colombia. A square. Night air thick with the smell of the coast, of palm oil and salt, and the particular staleness of a crowd that has been waiting too long in too much heat. The workers had been on strike for weeks. Their demands, the ones listed in chapter after chapter of company correspondence as unreasonable, as inspired by outside agitators, as fundamentally incompatible with the orderly operation of a commercial enterprise, were the same modest demands they had been making through legitimate channels for months. They had organized, they had petitioned, they had waited. United Fruit's position, communicated clearly through lawyers and government intermediaries, was that it would not negotiate with the workers directly. The company insisted that its employees were not technically its employees at all, that they were contracted through subagents, which meant that the company bore no legal obligation to meet with labor organizers, could not be held to collective bargaining, and therefore could not be compelled to address any of the workers' demands through any formal process. The legal structure was a wall, and the wall was working exactly as designed. The Colombian government, under pressure from the company and from Washington, dispatched General Carlos Cortes Vargas and approximately 700 troops to the Banana Zone. The general issued an ultimatum. The workers gathering in the square in Cienaga were to disperse. They were told they had been declared a threat to public order. They were given a deadline. Many of them stood in that square with their families. They had nowhere else to go that was not company property. When the deadline passed, the troops opened fire. What happened next is one of those historical events whose truth lives in a range that the archive has never closed. The Colombian government's official figures in the aftermath put the dead at fewer than 50. Labor organizers and survivors spoke of hundreds. Later estimates, drawing on witness accounts and regional records, range from fewer than 50 to more than 1,000 dead. The upper number is likely too high. The lower number is almost certainly too low. What is not contested is that soldiers fired on a crowd of striking workers and their families, that the killing continued as people fled, and that United Fruit had organized the political conditions that made the deployment of those soldiers possible. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who grew up in that coastal banana zone, put the massacre inside 100 Years of Solitude, his great novel of Colombian history and forgetting. In his version, the bodies fill train cars and are dumped into the sea, and afterward the company and the government conspire to insist that nothing happened, that there were no workers, that there was no strike, that there was no square, that no one died. The specific numbers in Garcia Marquez are fiction. The mechanism he describes, institutional amnesia manufactured from above, is the most accurate account of what followed that anyone has written. Here is the weight of it in the plain language of verified record. United Fruit held 220,000 acres in Colombia's banana zone at the time of the strike. 25,000 workers had been pressing for better conditions across those fields. 700 troops were sent to end it. The death toll, by official count, was fewer than 50. By any honest accounting of the available evidence, it was more. And afterward, the company continued to operate. The strike was broken. The demands went unmet. The company store remained open. The credit slips were still accepted. The 6-day work week, the hygienic dormitories, and the accident compensation never arrived. The system resumed. The massacre was not a malfunction. It was not a moment when the company's otherwise reasonable logic broke down under pressure and produced something monstrous by accident. The Cienaga Square revealed what the system looked like when it decided that the cost of negotiation was higher than the cost of violence. Was this the system malfunctioning, or the system finally showing its face? Chapter 9. Peak Empire, Hidden Rot. By the early 1950s, United Fruit Company looked from the outside like a permanent fixture of the American commercial landscape. It was the largest employer in Central America. It was one of the largest landowners in the Western Hemisphere. Its Great White Fleet, the refrigerated steamships that carried bananas north and tourists south, was one of the most recognizable private fleets in the world. Its name appeared in newspapers as a symbol of American enterprise, American efficiency, American reach. The company did not merely sell bananas. It was, in the imagination of its era, a demonstration of what American capitalism could build when given the right conditions. The right conditions, of course, were the ones the company had spent 50 years arranging. What was invisible from the outside, buried in government memos and Justice Department files that would not be declassified for decades, was that the United States government had known for a long time that United Fruit was a problem. Not a political problem, a legal one. The antitrust concerns were not new. Recommendations for action against the company had existed inside the Justice Department since 1913. They had surfaced again in 1937. Formal investigations had resumed in 1946 and again in 1951. By the time those investigations reached their conclusions, Justice had accumulated enough evidence to believe that United Fruit's control of the banana trade, its ownership of land far beyond cultivation needs, its stranglehold on port access, its exclusive shipping arrangements, its systematic elimination of competitors, constituted antitrust violations serious enough to justify divestiture. Not a fine, not a consent decree. The breakup of the company itself. That action was not taken. Not in 1913, not in 1937, not in 1946, and not initially in 1951. Each time, national security arguments arrived to delay the legal machinery. The company was important to American interests in the region. The company provided logistical infrastructure the military valued. The company's operations in Central America were a stabilizing presence. The language changed slightly each decade, but the function was consistent. The company had become, in the eyes of the government charged with regulating it, difficult to separate from the interests of the United States itself. That fusion between a private corporation and the machinery of American foreign policy was not unique to United Fruit. But United Fruit perfected it earlier and more thoroughly than almost anyone else, and here is what that fusion conceals until you look directly at it. A company that cannot be broken up because it has become politically indispensable is a company that has successfully converted its size into immunity. The antitrust law exists to prevent exactly this outcome. The fact that the law was repeatedly delayed in application to United Fruit is not evidence that the law was working. It is evidence that the company had grown large enough to be above it. The civil antitrust suit against United Fruit was finally filed on July 2, 1954. The date matters. July 2, 1954 was 5 days after Jacobo Arbenz resigned the presidency of Guatemala. The coup had already succeeded. The land reform was already being reversed. The immediate crisis, from the company's perspective, was over. The suit that had been delayed for years was filed into the aftermath of a victory. Was United Fruit powerful because it served American interests, or protected because it had become, over 50 years of careful entanglement, genuinely impossible to separate from them? The two answers are not mutually exclusive. That is precisely what makes them so difficult to confront. Chapter 10. Guatemala, the place where land meant everything. Guatemala in the early 1950s was a country whose history was written in the distribution of land. For most of the preceding century, the country had been organized around a specific agreement between those who governed and those who owned. The state would provide labor, infrastructure, and political order, and the large landowners, foreign and domestic, would provide tax revenue and the appearance of economic productivity. The indigenous Mayan population, which constituted the majority of the country's people, participated in this arrangement primarily as its labor supply. They worked on the large estates, the fincas, under conditions that in some regions preserved elements of debt peonage well into the 20th century. They owned almost nothing. The numbers, when they were finally surveyed in the early years of reform, were not subtle. 2% of the population controlled more than 72% of Guatemala's arable land. Less than 12% of privately held land was under active cultivation. A country that was predominantly agricultural, in which the majority of the population depended on land access for survival, had organized its land in a way that made the majority of the population permanently dependent on the terms offered by a tiny minority of landowners. United Fruit sat at the top of that structure. It had been there since the turn of the century, welcomed by dictators, rewarded with concessions, protected by contracts that bound successive governments regardless of who had signed them. Under Jorge Ubico, the strong man who governed Guatemala through the 1930s and into the 1940s, the company's position was untouchable. Ubico believed in order. He believed in foreign investment. He believed in the United States. He gave United Fruit everything it asked for and was given stability in return, his own stability, specifically the kind that comes from having a powerful American company invested in the continuation of your government. The Revolution of 1944 changed the terms. Ubico was removed. A democratic process, tentative and improbable in a country with almost no institutional tradition of it, began to take shape. Juan José Arevalo became president, then Jacobo Arbenz after him, elected in 1950 with 65% of the vote, which was a number that surprised even his supporters. Arbenz was a military officer. He was not a communist. He had grown up watching Guatemala's land system from close enough to understand that it was not inevitable, that it had been built deliberately, by specific decisions made by specific people over specific decades, and that it could therefore be rebuilt differently. His land reform program was not a radical program by the standards of the post-war world. It was, in its essential architecture, the kind of rural reform that the United States had itself encouraged in Japan and Taiwan after the war as a method of preventing communist appeal among landless peasants. The difference, in Guatemala, was that the land in question largely belonged to an American company. The company's contracts, accumulated across the previous 30 years under Estrada Cabrera, Ubico, and the governments between them, had given United Fruit preferential tax rates, port access, and rail rights. Arbenz's government began reviewing those contracts. It found that the terms were, by any neutral measure, extraordinarily favorable to the company and extraordinarily costly to Guatemala. Import duties that other businesses paid, United Fruit was exempt from. Port fees that other operators paid, United Fruit negotiated down. Tax obligations that the Constitution required, United Fruit's contracts superseded. Arbenz moved to renegotiate. United Fruit's response was to begin preparing for war, not a military war, not yet, but a different kind. The war of narrative, of lobbying, of diplomatic pressure, of turning a land dispute in a small Central American country into a crisis of global ideological significance. When reform comes to a country built on skewed land ownership, it is never just a policy question. It is a question about who the country is for, and that question, once asked seriously, tends to provoke the people who built the answer. Chapter 11. Decree 900. On June 17, 1952, Guatemala's Congress passed Decree 900. It was a land reform law. It was, by the international standards of the post-war period, a moderate one. The mechanics were straightforward. Any privately held land above 223 acres that was not under active cultivation was subject to expropriation by the state and redistribution to landless peasants. Landowners would be compensated. The compensation would take the form of 25-year government bonds paying 3% annual interest. The value of the compensation would be based on the declared tax value of the land, the value the landowner had reported to the tax authorities. That last detail was, quietly, everything. For decades, large landowners in Guatemala, like large landowners in most of Central America, had declared their holdings at the lowest defensible value for tax purposes. Low declarations meant low taxes. The system had functioned year after year as a private arrangement between wealth and governance, and no one with the power to change it had any incentive to do so. United Fruit was no exception. Its hundreds of thousands of acres of idle Guatemalan land had been declared to the tax authorities at values that reflected what the company preferred to pay, not what the land would command in an honest market. Decree 900 turned that calculation inside out. When the Guatemalan government moved to expropriate United Fruit's idle land, it offered compensation based on exactly the values the company had provided. The company said those values were wrong. The company said its land was worth far more. The government's position was simple. These were your numbers. You chose them. You paid taxes on them for years. They are now the basis of your compensation. In early 1953, approximately 234,000 acres of United Fruit land near Tiquisate were ordered expropriated. In February of 1954, another 172,532 acres near Bananera followed. The government offered the company just over $600,000 for the first expropriation, based precisely on United Fruit's own declared tax valuations. United Fruit countered that the land was worth more than $15 million. The difference between those two numbers is the distance between what the company had told the Guatemalan state for years and what the company actually believed its land was worth. That gap, more than $14 million wide, is not a rounding error. It is a record of the relationship between the company and the state it operated inside. The workers who received redistributed land under Decree 900 were overwhelmingly indigenous Guatemalans for whom land access was not an investment portfolio, it was the material condition of survival. In the 18 months following the law's passage, approximately 100,000 families received land. For those families, Decree 900 was not ideology. It was a plot of ground they could farm. For United Fruit, it was an existential threat dressed in the language of democratic reform. The company engaged its lawyers. It engaged its lobbyists. It engaged its public relations firm. It engaged, through channels that were not entirely informal, the United States Department of State. Was Decree 900 democratic land reform? An attempt to address a land distribution so skewed that a functioning agricultural economy was impossible without it? Or was it, as the company and its allies increasingly argued in Washington, something darker, a law that communist elements inside the Guatemalan government could use to consolidate rural power, to radicalize the peasantry, to build the kind of organizational base from which a Soviet-aligned movement might emerge? The law was the same law regardless of which answer you chose. What changed, depending on your answer, was what you were permitted to do about it. Chapter 12. The Plot Sold as a Plot. Here is the document that should be read first, before all the others. In 1952, the Central Intelligence Agency produced an information report on Jacobo Arbenz and the political situation in Guatemala. It was an internal document. It was not written for publication or for the press. It was written by analysts for policymakers, the kind of assessment designed to tell the people who make decisions what is actually happening, stripped of the narratives those people might prefer. The report concluded that Arbenz's social reform ideas stemmed from the United States New Deal rather than from Soviet communism. Read that again. The CIA's own internal analysis in 1952 found that the Guatemalan president pursuing land reform was drawing his political ideas from Franklin Roosevelt, not from Joseph Stalin. That document existed. It circulated. It did not change what happened next. What happened next was a sustained, coordinated campaign to convince the American public, the American press, and the American government that Guatemala was, in fact, a Soviet beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, a communist infiltration that threatened the stability of the region and required immediate action. The campaign had two engines, running simultaneously and in close coordination. The first engine was United Fruit's public relations operation, directed by Edward Bernays. Bernays was not a lobbyist in the conventional sense. He was the architect of modern public relations, the man who had, among other things, convinced American women to smoke cigarettes in public by calling them torches of freedom. He understood that the most effective way to change what people believe is not to argue with them, but to reshape the context in which their beliefs form. He arranged press tours to Guatemala. He seeded the American media with stories about communist infiltration. He cultivated relationships with journalists and editors who found in Guatemala exactly the story he had prepared for them to find. The second engine was inside the United States government, and it ran on the fuel of genuine ideological fear and something considerably less genuine, the professional and financial entanglements between the company and the officials making the decisions. John Foster Dulles was Secretary of State. His law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, had represented United Fruit in its Guatemalan negotiations. Allen Dulles was director of the CIA. He had served on United Fruit's board. These were not secret relationships. They were simply not considered disqualifying in the political culture of the period, which is its own kind of information about what that culture valued. Inside the State Department's own records, the tension between the two explanations for the Guatemala crisis was preserved with unusual clarity. At a 1954 meeting, Guatemala's ambassador made the argument directly. The real issue, he said, was United Fruit's stranglehold on ports, railways, and other essential infrastructure. The official American response, documented in the same record, was that the issue is communism in the Guatemalan government, not the United Fruit question. Ambassador John Purifoy, the senior American diplomat in Guatemala, made the strategic logic even plainer in a private cable. He advised Washington to play down the fruit company problem and concentrate on the communist issue. Not because the fruit company problem was not real, because it was less useful. Anti-communism, in the political climate of 1954, was a language that unlocked resources, justified action, and required no further explanation. A land dispute between a Central American government and an American corporation was a complicated story with sympathetic parties on multiple sides. A communist takeover in the American backyard was a simple story with a clear villain. Bernays could not have written a better brief. The CIA information report sat in its file. The ambassador's cables circulated. The press tours ran. The newspaper stories appeared. Guatemala was becoming, in the American imagination, a crisis. Did Washington believe its own story? Or did anti-communism simply become the language that made corporate defense politically usable? The record does not fully resolve that question, which is exactly why it remains alive. There were people in the Eisenhower administration who appear to have believed with complete sincerity that Guatemala represented a genuine communist threat. There were others for whom the communist framing was a tool, picked up because it worked. The CIA report from 1952 suggests that at least some of the analysts whose job it was to know the difference knew the difference. That report did not change the outcome. The narrative was already moving faster than the evidence. Chapter 13, PBSUCCESS. The operation had a name, PBSUCCESS. It was not a military invasion. There were no divisions massing at the border, no carrier groups in the Caribbean, no formal declaration of anything by anyone. What the CIA designed and executed in the spring and summer of 1954 was something more precise and, in its way, more instructive. A coup assembled from rumor, from radio, from psychological pressure, and from the carefully managed appearance of an overwhelming force that did not actually exist. The architecture was layered. A small group of Guatemalan exiles, led by a military officer named Carlos Castillo Armas, was trained, equipped, and positioned in Honduras and Nicaragua with American support. They were not a large force. They were not by any military measure capable of defeating the Guatemalan army in an open engagement. That was not the point. The point was not to win a war. The point was to make the Guatemalan government believe it had already lost one. The most important weapon in PBSUCCESS was a radio station. The CIA operated a clandestine broadcast that called itself the Voice of Liberation, La Voz de la Liberación, and it transmitted as though it were broadcasting from deep inside Guatemala, from the heart of a popular uprising already underway. It was not broadcasting from inside Guatemala. It was broadcasting from outside the country, scripted by CIA officers, designed to sound like the voice of an irresistible tide turning against Arbenz. It reported troop movements that had not happened. It announced victories that had not occurred. It described a military situation that existed only in the frequency it occupied. The Guatemalan army, uncertain about what was real and what was broadcast, uncertain about the loyalty of their own officers, uncertain about whether the Americans would eventually arrive with something more than radio signals, began to fracture. Senior officers met with Arbenz and told him they could not guarantee the army's continued support. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz resigned the presidency. In his resignation address, he named the thing plainly. "They have taken the pretext of communism," he said. "The truth is elsewhere." The truth he was pointing to was specific. The land that had been redistributed to 100,000 Guatemalan families under Decree 900 began to be returned systematically to the landowners from whom it had been taken. Castillo Armas, installed as the new leader with American recognition arriving within days, reversed the agrarian reform almost immediately. The peasants who had received land under the law lost it. The contracts that had governed United Fruit's relationship with the Guatemalan state were, not immediately but steadily, restored to terms the company found acceptable. The coup cost Guatemala something that cannot be expressed in acreage. The democratic opening that had begun in 1944, imperfect, contested, real, was closed. What followed, across the next 4 decades, was a succession of military governments and a civil war that killed an estimated 200,000 people, the majority of them indigenous Guatemalans. The relationship between that civil war and the 1954 coup is contested among historians in its specifics and largely uncontested in its broad outline. The COU ended the possibility of political reform through democratic means, and political movements that might have operated within democratic institutions were instead driven underground, where they eventually became armed ones. The acreage figures, the expropriation orders, the tax valuations, the bond compensations, all of that paper, all of that legal machinery that had set the crisis in motion was rendered moot by a radio station that told lies in the right frequency. Was this the overthrow of a communist government threatening the hemisphere, or the moment that corporate land claims acquired the force of American geopolitics? The CIA report from 1952 is still in the archive. It still says what it said. The coup happened anyway. Chapter 14. What victory looked like on the ground. Victory in 1954 looked like this. The land went back. The families who had farmed it for 18 months under Decree 900 lost it. The reform was not paused or reviewed or modified. It was erased. The legal architecture built over 2 years of democratic deliberation was undone in weeks by a government that had arrived on the back of a radio signal and American recognition. United Fruit's expropriated acreage was not immediately returned in full. The legal mechanisms were complicated, and the political atmosphere, even after the coup, was not simple. But the pressure that had produced the expropriation was gone. The government no longer wanted the land. The reform apparatus was dismantled. The contracts were renegotiated on terms that looked, with some variation, like the contracts that had existed before Arbenz. Washington increased its financial support to Guatemala substantially in the years immediately after 1954. Aid that had been withheld or conditioned during the Arbenz years flowed again. The new government was presented to the American public as a restoration of stability, a reversal of communist infiltration, a success of American policy in the Cold War's quieter theaters. On the ground, stability meant something specific. Labor organizing was suppressed. Political parties associated with the reform period were banned. Figures from the Arbenz government were arrested, some killed, others driven into exile. The space that had opened in 1944 for political participation, for union organizing, for indigenous political movements, for the kind of messy, imperfect democratic process that land reform had moved through, that space was closed and locked. The banana workers felt the closing, too. Not only in Guatemala. On May 5, 1954, the same month that Castillo Armas's exile force was being positioned on the Honduran border, approximately 14,000 United Fruit workers in Honduras launched a general strike. They were demanding a 50% wage increase. The timing placed two of the company's great pressures in the same frame. A coup being organized in one country to reverse land reform, and a mass labor action in another demanding wages the company did not want to pay. The Honduras strike was eventually resolved through negotiation rather than massacre. The context of 1954, a world watching Guatemala, a company whose political capital was already stretched, may have made outright repression in Honduras less available as a tool. The workers won some concessions. The strike became one of the foundational moments of Honduran labor history. But Guatemala was not Honduras. What happened in Guatemala after the coup was not negotiation. It was the systematic removal of every institutional mechanism through which the people the reform had been designed to help might have continued to press their case. Here are the numbers that belong in the same breath, the ones that quantify what 1954 actually cost. 100,000 families received land under Decree 900. All of it was lost. 14,000 workers struck in Honduras, demanding a 50% wage increase that very same month. 200,000 people died in the Guatemalan Civil War that followed the coup across the next 4 decades. The antitrust suit against United Fruit was filed 5 days after Arbenz fell. The CIA had concluded 2 years earlier that Arbenz resembled Roosevelt more than Stalin. If the COUP restored order, the order it restored was not peace. It was the enforced quiet of a country that had learned, at considerable cost, what happened when it asked the wrong questions too loudly. Chapter 15. The name changed, the shadow stayed. Empires do not end. They reorganize. United Fruit Company became United Brands in 1970. United Brands became Chiquita in 1990. The banana with the blue sticker, cheerful and familiar on every grocery shelf in America, was the product of a company that had changed its name twice since the coup, and continued under each new name to operate in the same countries, on much of the same land, with a version of the same logic. The antitrust suit, filed in July of 1954, eventually produced a consent decree. The company was required to divest some holdings, to sell its Guatemalan railway interests, to create conditions under which competition might theoretically develop. The Justice Department had believed for decades that the violations were serious enough to justify breaking the company apart entirely. What it got, in the end, was a negotiated settlement that left the company intact and operating. The banana empire survived its own antitrust case the way it had survived everything else, by making itself expensive enough to dismantle that the dismantling never fully arrived. The legacy compounded quietly through the following decades, accumulating in the background of American consumer life the way old debts accumulate, present, but not discussed at the table. In Colombia, the country where federal troops had fired on striking workers in the square at Cienaga in 1928, the political violence never fully stopped. By the 1990s, the banana-growing regions of northwestern Colombia were among the most contested territories in the country's long internal conflict. Paramilitary groups, operating in the space between the state and the guerrillas, controlled territory through murder and displacement. They were designated terrorist organizations by the United States government. Between 1997 and 2004, Chiquita Brands International made more than 100 payments to one of those paramilitary groups, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, known as the AUC. The payments totaled more than $1.7 million. Chiquita's internal records, later made public through legal proceedings, showed that company executives had been told the payments were going to a designated terrorist organization and had been advised that continuing to make them was illegal. The advice was documented. The payments continued. In 2007, Chiquita pleaded guilty to a federal charge of engaging in transactions with a specially designated global terrorist organization. It agreed to pay a criminal fine of $25 million. In June of 2024, a Florida jury considered a civil case brought by families of 8 Colombian men killed by the AUC. The jury found Chiquita liable. It ordered the company to pay $38.3 million in damages. The company that had begun as a Boston produce operation in 1899, that had accumulated 550,000 acres in Guatemala and 220,000 in Colombia, that had managed a national postal service and owned the only deep-water port, that had organized the political conditions for a massacre in 1928 and a coup in 1954, that had changed its name twice and survived its antitrust case and rebranded its banana. That company was still, in 2024, being held to account for funding the killing of Colombian civilians in the 1990s and 2000s. The label on the crate had changed. The company's relationship to political violence in the banana zones had not changed enough to prevent what the Florida jury found. There is a line that runs, not perfectly but visibly, from the dock at Puerto Barrios in 1904 to the courtroom in Florida in 2024. It runs through the square at Cienaga and the radio station transmitting lies in 1954, and the plea agreement signed in Washington in 2007. It runs through every acre that was accumulated beyond cultivation needs, every rail concession written to outlast the government that granted it, and every memo that said to concentrate on the communist issue and not the fruit company problem. United Fruit did not merely grow bananas inside weak states. It built the kind of land, transport, and political leverage that made parts of those states function around it. When the states tried to function for themselves instead, the company reached for whatever tool was available: lawyers, lobbyists, public relations, governments, and, in Colombia across 50 years, the men with weapons. The banana is still one of the cheapest fruits in the American grocery store. It still fits in a child's hand. It still requires no preparation, no tools, no instruction. It still does not come with a label that explains where it has been.